Slide. Next, we'll talk about state and federal efforts. So I'll turn the presentation over to Kamilah.
Great. Thank you so much. So I was asked to present on, again, state and federal efforts. So again, my name is Kamilah Moore. I am the chairperson of the California Reparations Task Force. A little bit about me. I'm from Los Angeles, California originally. Went to UCLA for undergrad, Columbia Law School, graduated there 2019, and also studied abroad and received a Master of Laws or an LLM from University of Amsterdam Law School in the Netherlands, where I specialize in international criminal law, and pretty much utilize that experience to leverage a position on the task force and to become chair of the first in the nation California Reparations Task Force. So again, the California Reparations Task Force, it started off as a statute called AB 3121, and it was championed by California Secretary of State Shirley Weber when she was in the Assembly. It was signed by California Governor Gavin Newsom in October 2020. It is a 2-year undertaking, so we first started meeting as a 9-member task force last year in July. And we will finish our work in July of next year. So this past year, I've characterized as the study phase, where we have invited several people to provide personal and expert testimony on a wide range of topics, chronologically starting with the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and then the impetus and implications of the Great Migration. So what that means is what drove Black folks from the South to come to California in the first place, and what did they experience? And so, yes, so that has been, that's marked a year of our work. And so then this next year of our work, we characterize as a development stage, where we're having substantive conversations as a 9-member task force about, okay, what does reparations look like on the state level based on the evidence that we've collected that is memorialized and enshrined in this 500-page, 13-chapter interim report that the task force just released June 1 with the administrative, legal, and technical assistance of the California Department of Justice. Next slide. Please, thank you. So again, AB 3121 authorizes the task force to hold public hearings to pursue its mission in order to inform the contents of the interim report that we just released. The task force held 9 public meetings during which it considered public comments, expert and personal witness testimony, in addition to considering voluminous material submitted to the task force via email. So since we first met last year, we have heard over 40 hours of testimony from over 103 witnesses, 16 hours of public comment, and we received over 1,000 emails and over 100 phone calls. Next slide, please. So here is a list, a sample of the virtual public hearing topics that the California Reparations Task Force has organized since last year. And you can find all of our public hearings on the California DOJ's YouTube playlist. So again, our first hearing, substantive hearing, was in September of last year. We talked about the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and the impetus and implications of the Great Migration. So for example, we invited to provide expert testimony people like Douglas Blackman, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner and wrote a book called Slavery by Another Name. Or, for instance, Isabel Wilkerson, who is the first African-American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize in journalism. She wrote the book Caste and Warmth of the Other Sons, which is about the Great Migration. Our next hearing was in October. We held a hearing on discrimination in housing, banking, tax, and labor. And again, we invited A-list folks to provide expert and personal testimony on those topics. November, we discussed gentrification, infrastructure, and homelessness. We invited people who were directly impacted by these issues as well. December 2021, we held a hearing on entertainment, sports, arts, and culture. January 2022, discrimination in technology. February, we had a Black History celebration, memorializing the long history of reparations advocacy in the United States. In March, the 9-member task force voted to determine who should be eligible for reparations in the state. And we voted for a lineage-based rather than a race-based model. So what that means is that not all Black Californians will be eligible for reparations in the state, but those who can trace their ancestry or lineage to those who were enslaved in this country. And the exact lineage motion was, if you are a descendant of a free or an enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900, you are eligible. At our March hearing, we also talked about the criminal legal system. And then April 2022, we held our first in-person meeting on unequal and separate education in San Francisco at the historic Third Baptist Church, where Vice Chair Pastor Amos Brown is a pastor of. And our next meeting actually is in September. So it's coming up soon in Los Angeles. Location to be determined. The date will be in the last week of September. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual to give folks some understanding. To the left is the signing ceremony of AB 3121, where California Governor Gavin Newsom signed the bill into law, which created the task force. And you see some notable state senators, assembly members, and other folks who were intimately involved in getting this legislation to the governor's desk. And to the right is a picture of all of the task force members at our first meeting where we took our oath of office. So I'll be brief and I'll name the members. Top left is Professor Jovan Scott Lewis. He is the chair of geography studies at UC Berkeley. Don Tamaki, to the right of him, is an attorney and was instrumental in the Korematsu case and the Japanese American Redress Campaign movement, where Japanese Americans successfully lobbied reparations from the federal government for internment. We have Senator Stephen Bradford of Gardena, Lisa Holder, who is a renowned civil rights attorney. In the middle is Dr. Cheryl Grills, who is a psychologist at Loyola Marymount University. To the right of her is Monica Montgomery Stepp, who is the president pro tempore of the San Diego City Council. You have myself, so lawyer, attorney, repertory justice scholar. To the right of me is Assembly Member Reggie Jones Sawyer. And then, of course, last but not least, the vice chair of the committee, Pastor Amos Brown, who is on the board of the National NAACP and is the president of the San Francisco NAACP, and is actually one of only 11 students who was actually a student of Martin Luther King Jr. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about the interim report that we just released. So again, the interim report that the California Reparations Task Force just released, it has, the official seal of the state of California. It's 500 pages long, 13 chapters. And you can find this in the introduction section of the report that's available online at oag.ca.gov/AB3121/reports. So I'll be brief because I know we've been here for a while and we're talking about reparations. We can go on and on and on because it's a lot of history. But in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution commanded that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. So a lot of people know those facts, but a lot of people don't know what I'm about to say now. In supporting the passage of the 13th Amendment, its co-author, Senator Lyman Trumbull of Illinois, said that it is perhaps difficult to draw the precise line to say where freedom ceases and slavery begins. So in 1883, in the civil rights cases, the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, interpreted the 13th Amendment as empowering Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for abolishing all badges and incidents of slavery. So that begs the question, what are the badges and incidents of slavery? Next slide, please. So this is from legal scholarship from a renowned constitutional law professor, Jennifer Mason McAward, from her article, Defining the Badges and Incidents of Slavery. And the best understanding of the badges and incidents of slavery refers to public or widespread private action aimed at any racial group or population that has previously been held in slavery or servitude, that mimics the law of slavery and has significant potential to lead to the de facto reenslavement or legal subjugation of the targeted group. Next slide. So again, this is what you'll find in the introduction section of our report. This is what we concluded as a task force, which is laying the foundation for the claim for reparations for African Americans on the state, city, and federal level. Throughout the rest of American history, instead of abolishing the badges and incidents of slavery, the United States federal, state, and local governments, including California and the cities within, perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. The resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed over generations. So the interim report focuses on these harms, focuses on these badges and incidents. There are countless badges and incidents, and it will be impossible to describe every harm done to African Americans since our existence on this land. But in order to address this practical reality, the interim report of the Reparations Task Force describes just a sample of government actions and private action and the compounding harms that have resulted, and we've organized them into 12 specific areas of systemic discrimination. Next slide, please. So again, as I referenced, the 500-page interim report that we just released is 13 chapters long. And each chapter, aside from the introduction, describes a badge and incident of slavery that still impacts African Americans today. And again, we focus on the major 12, but there's others, obviously. So after the first chapter on enslavement, where we talk about California's role in perpetuating slavery, because that's another narrative we had to disrupt. A lot of people say, why is California doing a reparations task force? California never had slavery, but that's something that we learned early on in this process. In September, at our first hearing, we invited people like Professor Stacy Smith of Oregon State University, who is a scholar on California's role in perpetuating slavery. And she noted that there was over 1,500 Black people who were enslaved in California at one point, and also 2 years after California was admitted into the Union, so in 1852, California actually enacted a fugitive slave law or act that was much more aggressive than the federal fugitive slave law that existed at that time. So the practical implications of that is, if you so happen to be a free Black person living in California, after it was admitted into the Union in 1850, and definitely after that fugitive slave law was enacted in California in 1852, you could be deported to the South to be enslaved, or in some instances, enslaved on California soil. So again, the first chapter, enslavement, there's a California section and a federal section. And the same structure applies to the rest of the chapter. So there's a California and federal section for each of the remaining chapters that describes the federal and state role in perpetuating these badges and incidents. So the second chapter is on racial terror. The third is on political disenfranchisement. Housing segregation is the fourth chapter. Separate and unequal education is the fifth. Racism and environment and infrastructure, pathologizing the Black family, control over creative and cultural intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, the unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect. And then the 13th or the last chapter is on the wealth gap. And I'm about to conclude. There's just a couple more slides left. Next slide, please. So this data and these pictorials, they're also in the report that is publicly available. So this data and this graphic is from the 13th or the last chapter of the report on the wealth gap. And this is what we found federal and California Homestead Acts essentially gave away hundreds of millions of acres of land almost for free, mostly to white families. African Americans were excluded from the federal and California Homestead Acts. What are the implications of that today? As many as 46 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits of those acts. So approximately 1/4 of the adult population of the United States, that being 1/4 of the white adult population, still benefit from their ancestors receiving free land grants by virtue of the federal and California Homestead Acts that African Americans were excluded from. So another graphic around the wealth gap. In 2019, white households owned 9 times more assets than Black households. Next slide, please. So as it relates to anti-Black hate crimes and police brutality, prior to popular belief, African Americans are the #1 victims and targets of hate crimes, not only in the city of Los Angeles, but in the state of California and on the federal government level as well. And this data is actually from the FBI's website. There's been an 88% increase in anti-Black hate crimes from 2019 to 2020. And then also these graphics are from our report. So that was primarily written by civil rights attorneys at the California Department of Justice Civil Rights Section. There are 6% Black Californians here in the state, represent over 18.9% of those killed by the police. Next slide, please. So it's just the last couple of data sets that really show why reparations is needed, particularly for the African American descendants of slave population. So again, Black folks in California make up 6% of the population, but over 40% of the unhoused. Actually, African Americans own less homes today than they did in 1910. Next slide, please. So this is data from the federal level that shows why reparations is also needed on a federal level. But before I do that, I just want to note there are some Culver City specific facts in the interim report. In the interim report, we relied on a scholar named Richard Lowen, on his scholarship around sundown towns. And it's important to note that through his research, he found that California had more sundown towns than the entire South, which Lowen attributes to the culture of racism in the South, preferring to exploit rather than exclude Black residents. In this report, there is data or statistics and data information that talks about how in 1943, the Culver city attorney, instructed certain employees to marginalize Japanese American residents that lived in the city. And while they were doing that, the city attorney also instructed them to make sure that there were racial restrictive covenants so that African Americans could not buy homes in this city. So in this report, there is actually a table of different sundown towns throughout the state of California. I didn't include it in the slide, but the sundown towns identified in California include Brea, Bishop, Burbank, Corning, Culver City, Glendale, Hawthorne, La Jolla in San Diego, numerous other suburbs of Los Angeles, Palos Verdes, Richmond, San Marino, South Pasadena, Taft, and Tarzana. And again, sundown towns were places where sometimes it was explicit in terms of signs and sometimes it was implicit, where, African Americans knew not to go to these cities after dark or they would be subjected to violence. So, murder, death, all of that. And so the last 2 slides, again, is about federal data on reparations. In the interest of time, I'll just note one. So for instance, over 90% of lynching victims in America have been Black. Less than 1% of those who did the lynching have been prosecuted. Next slide. And then again, for the interest of time, I will only highlight, I guess, one data set. So in 1931, there was something called the Mother's Pensions Recipient Fund. That it was a fund that went to poor mothers in the United States. Over 96% of those recipients were white women, and only 3% were Black women. And for instance, African Americans, youth represent over 41% of juvenile facilities, despite making only 13% of the federal population. We make up less than 3.5% of business owners, over 23% of foster youth, and 77% more likely to be removed from homes. And that's even controlling white families who are in similar situated scenarios in the case of foster care. So that's the end of my presentation. Next slide. If folks want to learn more about the task force, again, you can go to our website at oag.ca.gov/AB3121. And if you want to get direct access to the report, go to that site as well. Or you can just add /reports after that website. You can email us directly, the 9-member task force, at reparationstaskforce@doj.ca.gov. You can watch all of our past hearings on the California DOJ's playlist, and there's a Reparations Task Force playlist. I know the next slide is going to be on legal considerations, and I'll just briefly talk about that and state if the Culver City Council is serious about reparative justice, something that the California Reparations Task Force did